They quiet. In 1850, the Cuban American Narcisco Lopez is quietly walking through the rainforests of Cuba, leading hundreds of volunteers in an attempt to overthrow the Cuban government. An explosion sounds out. Several men fall. An hour later, Narcisco Lopez has been defeated. He's captured by the Cuban government and later exiled. His random attempt as a Cuban American to come from America and topple the Cuban government completely failed. His few hundred volunteers are captured and the attempt falls apart. The Hill reports exactly how this happened, details its history, and as we can see, and this is a story that will be frequently repeated. This was only the first of many attempts. Welcome to the story of the US and Cuba. Today's prompt is, will the United States escalate pressure on Cuba? And to answer this prompt, we must start with the past. Then we'll talk about the present, and finally we'll talk about the promise that America must make to Cuba. To begin with the past, where were we? Right, Narcisco Lopez, walking through the jungle, captured and executed by the Cuban government. His attempt failed, but that was only just the beginning. John Quitman, the Mississippi governor, saw this failed plan and decided that he could do much better. With the approval of the US federal government, this Mississippi governor began gathering up thousands of troops in order to go invade Cuba. However, his plan was to take over Cuba in order to make it a slave state. The North, opposed to slavery, also was opposed to this invasion of Cuba, and eventually, in order to not cause political crisis, John Quitman, the governor of Mississippi, relented. He agreed not to invade Cuba. Later, in 1959, the communists took over the island of Cuba, just 90 miles south of Florida. As communists took over this government, this was a danger to the United States, which was in conflict with the greatest of all communist countries, the USSR, now known as Russia. The USSR supported Cuba, and to have an enemy of the United States only 90 miles off the coast was a danger the US would not tolerate. Yet again, the US invaded. In the Bay of Pigs incident in 1961, US President John F. Kennedy organized for US troops to train commandos in Cuba to cause a revolution and overthrow the communist government. It was, yet again, a disaster. These Cuban commandos rushed in, attempted to cause a revolution, and were instead quickly dismantled and executed. Yet again, a US attempt to change the regime in Cuba failed. Yet again, the US retreated. Notice the theme. The US wants to change the government of Cuba, and in past cases, even take over the island for itself. Now that we've seen this theme in the past, let's move on to the present. The Guardian reported on January 28, 2026, that Cuba is yet again in trouble. This time it's not in trouble from an invasion from the US, but simply Cuba is running out of money. And it's the US's fault. The US toppled the socialist government of Venezuela only a few months ago. Venezuela, being a socialist country, was closely allied with Cuba and sent approximately 70,000 barrels of oil to Cuba every single day. This supply of oil to Cuba was what allowed Cuba to maintain power. It gave the Cuban communist regime its money. However, as the US government toppled the socialist government in Venezuela, Cuba no longer has its long-standing ally. Without its long-standing ally, it also doesn't have its money. This is posing a major problem for Cuba. As the Council on Foreign Relations reports on March 31, 2026, that's today, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that Cuba needs to, quote, have a significant change, unquote. noted that the major problem in Cuba right now is the economy. And he's noted, shockingly, that communists seem unable to fix the economy. If communists aren't able to fix the economy, Marco Rubio notes that there may need to be a change of regime, or at least a change in philosophy in the communist government. So now that we've seen the present, this increasing pressure on Venezuela, let's talk about the promise that the US must make. BBC reported on March 13, 2026, that President Donald Trump threatened a, quote, friendly takeover of Cuba, unquote. Negotiations are currently ongoing between the United States and Cuba because the Cuban regime is scared that the US will increase pressures to the point that this communist regime falls. And as the US increases pressure, even Trump threatening to tariff Cuba, as the Guardian reports on January 28. With this increasing threat, the US must make a promise to Cuba. And as we've seen throughout this history of the US and Cuba, back from the days of Narcisco Lopez hiding in the jungle, to John Kidman, the governor of Mississippi, planning to invade Cuba, to the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, and to the present day, America has consistently tried to take over Cuba, take over its government, or change its government. This causes unease for Cuban citizens. The American government must make a promise that its goal is to construct a better Cuba, not to conquer Cuba. America doesn't need to take Cuba for itself, it needs to help Cuban citizens construct their own future. America must promise to construct, not to conquer. Unlike Narcisco Lopez's failed trek through the Cuban rainforests, America does have a chance to construct a better Cuba, and hopefully